Very good evening. You're watching India Sense. I'm Gaurie Dwivedi. Let's start the show with headlines coming in. First up, Trump administration completes 2 months and his tall claims about ending the two wars, Russia, Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, in just 24 hours, well, falls flat. We decode why the two conflicts are stuck at almost the same phase of negotiations, and how much political capital will Donald Trump now spend is the key question. India-China make reconciliatory statements towards peace after Prime Minister Modi's positive comments. Chinese Foreign Ministry responds by suggesting the two Asian giants must work together. China has been identified by the US as its biggest threat. Could this explain the changed course? We read the tea leaves for you. Eight months since taking office as the interim advisor of Bangladesh, Mohammed Yunus reaches out to meet Prime Minister Modi on the sidelines of BIMSTEC. Will India snub Mohammed Yunus is the key question. Despite India's efforts to reach out to all stakeholders, President Trump pressed ahead on 2nd of April tariff threat, dampening prospects of any concessions. Agriculture and farmer products could be most impacted. And riding on Conservative Party's turnaround of ratings, Prime Minister Mark Carney is all set to announce snap polls either on the 28th of April or 5th of May. With Carney keen to rebuild ties with India, the elections could mark a complete revival in the bilateral relationship. Big story on India Sense this week. Well, viewers, it's been 2 months since President Trump took office, and as things stand, the two wars that he promised to end in 24 hours are still waging. Almost daily, President Trump has said that had he been the president, these wars, particularly the Russia-Ukraine war, would not even have started. But his poll promise that he would be able to stop them in a day have all but fallen flat. And both these wars are stuck at the same juncture, struggling with the same factors, which brings me to ask that are these promises now in great peril? Take the war in Middle East. The first phase of ceasefire that was brokered by America was, well, simpler to put into motion. Israel released Palestinian convicts in exchange for the hostages that were kidnapped by Hamas since October 2023. And at the end, well, because it did not require both sides to give up anything, but it's the second phase that requires both sides to give up to be able to move towards peace, which is why negotiations are tougher. A phase 3 of this ceasefire looks almost distant at this stage, given that both parties are adamant on not giving up any control of Gaza. What happens to the 59 hostages that are still with Hamas is a key question. Trump and his team may talk about a post-war Gaza, but that scenario looks so distant that one can't even talk about it. Listen in first to the Israeli envoy who spoke to NDTV 48 hours back.
They see a future of Gaza without Hamas. This is what has to happen. How it's going to happen, how long it's going to take, this is something that is completely up to Hamas. They can finish this by releasing the hostages that illegally took in a brutal way. They can finish this by relinquishing power in the Gaza Strip today.
Okay.
If they refuse, this can take a very long time.
Okay, now let's look at the Russia-Ukraine war. Trump administration and the president himself has put in a lot of political capital in ending this war. But what's on the table is a very limited ceasefire with just a halt on attacks on energy infrastructure. And that has also become now part of the deal which suits America. Listen in to what the White House spokesperson said on this. We come back and then tell you exactly how it's stuck in exactly the same way like the Israel war.
President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. He said that the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Now we have moved beyond the economic minerals deal. We are at a place of peace. We're at a partial ceasefire, and we're moving towards a full ceasefire and a long-standing peace in this conflict. And that's great news for the American public.
Now, the fact that hostilities will be reduced is a positive outcome, but will this lead to a larger and long-term peace settlement is uncertain, because just like Gaza, phase 1 is palatable to both sides, but the negotiations will now get tricky beyond here. Russia wants to only speak to the US. The tweets by Dmitry Medvedev, the man who probably best represents Russian view, is very clear. The Russian readout also mentions the word bilateral, referring to US and Russia. There's no Ukraine anywhere in the picture for Russians. But that's just part of the problem. The real problem is the prospect of making both sides give up some concessions and make some concessions for peace. For Russia, it will mean give up the idea that they can make Ukraine a vassal state, take as much territory as possible before they stop hostilities. For Ukraine, it will mean give up all US and NATO weapons and intelligence, both of which will mean it will not be able to fight this war anymore. Both Russia and Israel made it look like there were possible peace deals on the table for Trump administration to enact in record time. But reality of governance is such that what's really on the table are brief windows of peace. Top Voice segment on the show this week. Stephen Erlanger, who's the chief diplomatic correspondent of New York Times, joins me live from Berlin. Steve, thank you so much for taking out the time speaking to me on NDTV. The first question is that there is a very limited window that exists right now when it comes to peace, and it's not critical minerals now, it's expanded to energy infrastructure, and largely it's about protecting American energy interests, isn't it?
Well, to be honest, it's a little bizarre because Ukraine's nuclear power plants are owned by the state. Zaporizhia, which is the one in question, is being occupied by the Russians. So first you have to get agreement from the Russians to leave, which is a whole other problem. And then if it's going to be returned to Ukraine, why should America have it? I mean, Westinghouse has been involved with helping. So it's possible Westinghouse could continue a contract, but Trump's idea seems to be if the Americans own it somehow or own mining in Ukraine, it will help prevent Russia from invading again. But Americans were involved and American businesses were involved before the Russians invaded in February 2022. So it just seems to me that's not much of a security assurance.
Stephen, how does it reflect on the Trump administration, which was really pushing for a broader ceasefire and had invested enough and more political capital in getting there?
I think you're correct. I mean, to be honest, the Russians don't really want a ceasefire. And the Ukrainians don't really want a ceasefire either, not this kind of ceasefire. The person who wants the ceasefire is Donald Trump. And, you know, he's bent the Ukrainians to his will by, for a period of time, denying them crucial intelligence and targeting information. As Keith Kellogg said, hitting them over the head with a 2x4 like a mule. He has no such 2x4 to hit Putin in the head. He has less leverage with Russia. And I don't think Putin will, you know, easily go along. I mean, Putin wants to delay all this. He certainly wants to delay any serious negotiations until Russia takes back all the territory of Kursk, of Russia itself, that Ukraine now occupies. Now, it's almost done, but it is not yet done. And I think Putin will never go into serious negotiations until Russia has restored sovereignty over its own territory.
Okay. But military momentum is clearly with Russia right now, and it has no incentive whatsoever to agree to any ceasefire. Do you agree?
Well, first of all, let's get to a ceasefire. I mean, right now, they've only agreed to a 30-day cessation of attacks on each other's energy infrastructure, and that's not very much. So we've got a long way to go. If we're going to get a serious settlement, it'll be very complicated. If we're simply going to have a frozen conflict, the way we have, let's say, in Cyprus or North Korea, South Korea, that's a different argument. But at least the Trump people are on the record as saying they want a settlement with Ukraine that preserves Ukraine as a sovereign nation and provides it security guarantees. Now, that's their public position. They also say Ukraine won't be part of NATO and would have to give up some of its territory, which will be hard for Ukraine to swallow. But if it is in return for serious security guarantees and real sovereignty, then maybe Ukraine can wear it. But I think we're a far distance from that. So we may end up, much as you suggest, with a kind of frozen conflict. You know, Russia has the upper hand, but frankly, it has gained so little territory in the last 18 months, and it's done so at the cost of so many thousands of its own soldiers and North Korean soldiers dying. It's hard to say that's a great success, to be honest.
All right, Stephen, thanks much for speaking to me. It's not peace, but frozen conflicts that could really be the outcome of these negotiations. On that note, I'm going to slip into a very short break. We come back on the other side of India Sense and talk more about India-China ties and have they turned a new leaf. Stay with us. Is there a new wind blowing between India and China? Within 2 months of Trump administration, there are now platitudes on both sides. The tariff threat is one aspect which brings them together, but there are considerations on both sides. But before that, take a look at this report that tells you the India-China relationship and how it has quietly but steadily entered a new phase from just recovery now to rebuilding and putting in trust. In a world where geopolitical dynamics are in constant flux, two of the world's largest and most powerful economies in Asia, India and China, are redefining the contours of their relationship. Since agreeing to disengage and thaw tensions at the Ladakh border last October, both New Delhi and Beijing have emphasized on the need for closer bilateral ties amidst growing threats, especially the threat of American tariffs. In the wake of these uncertainties, the elephant and the dragon, despite their differences, must dance together, favoring healthy competition over conflicts.
भारत और चीन का संबंध ये कोई आज का नहीं है। दोनों पुरातन संस्कृति है, पुरातन सिविलाइजेशन है और मॉडर्न वर्ल्ड में भी अपनी उनकी भूमिका है। डिफरेंसेस तो होते हैं, दो पड़ोसी देश होते हैं तो कुछ ना कुछ तो होता है। ऑकेजनल डिसएग्रीमेंट भी बहुत स्वाभाविक है, कोई ऐसा तो हर चीज नहीं होता, एक परिवार में भी रहता है। लेकिन हमारी कोशिश है कि हमारे जो डिफरेंसेस हैं डिस्प्यूट में ना बदले, उस दिशा में हमारा प्रयास रहता है।
The two countries should be partners that contribute to each other's success. A cooperative pas de deux of the dragon and the elephant is the only right choice for both sides. China stands ready to work with India to implement the important common standings between the two leaders.
Yet all said and done, India and China have had highs and lows throughout history. Despite Prime Minister Modi's positive comments on China this week, it isn't necessarily reconciliation. New Delhi and Beijing do remain at odds over several issues, including China's rising aggression in the Indo-Pacific, growing ties with Pakistan and Bangladesh, Indian Army Chief General Upendra Dwivedi's cautionary tone that the rise of China as a dominant economic force hampers India's efforts to be the natural leader for the global south, and dangers of India's border security challenges is reflective of the trust deficit in this relationship. While diplomacy gives hope for stability, the ground reality may have a different answer to a very complex relationship of India and China. But a Trump administration that's unhinged is giving reason for both New Delhi and Beijing to move forward. On the Chinese side, there's apprehension since the Trump administration has named China as their biggest long-term threat. And could the Quad summit later this year to be held in Delhi prove to be that major turning point in Trump's policy towards Indo-Pacific? Reading the tea leaves is always a tricky matter, more so in the case of India-China relationship. The Trump administration has come good on its commitment on deporting foreign students who took part in pro-Palestinian protests. One such case that is there is the Badr Khan Suri case, an Indian researcher at the Georgetown University who was recently detained by US authorities due to his alleged connections with Hamas. A federal judge has blocked Suri's deportation for now, ordering that he cannot be removed from the country until further court action is taken. But who exactly is Badr Khan Suri, and how did he really get caught in the middle of Trump's intensified crackdown and now legal immigration as well under his crackdown? Take a look at this report.
The Trump administration has started taking decisive action against pro-Palestinian activists, especially non-citizens it deems sympathetic to Hamas. One such case is that of Badr Khan Suri, an Indian researcher at the Georgetown University recently detained by US authorities. The US government has cited his alleged close connections to a Hamas official as justification for revoking the visa, adding that he was actively spreading Hamas propaganda. Suri's attorneys argue the detention is unjustified since he has no criminal record. US President Donald Trump recently vowed a new crackdown on pro-Palestinian protesters on American college campuses, saying the detention of Mahmoud Khalil, a leader at Columbia University, was the first arrest of many more. Almost as soon as Trump walked into the White House, he had signed an executive order promising action against non-citizen pro-Palestinian protesters. There are allegations that these demonstrations have crossed the line from peaceful advocacy to disruption, intimidation, and in some cases, outright lawlessness. Critics argue the response has been excessive, but many Americans support the crackdown, citing concerns over security threats. Some experts warn that if such protests are left unchecked, they could create dangerous precedents, allowing groups to use civil unrest as a means of coercion.
Now, Trump's policies are drawing sharp lines between freedom of speech and the rule of law and placing foreign students under intense scrutiny. While the US champions its First Amendment right to free speech, the question really is, how far does this protection extend to foreign nationals who are on temporary visas? They are not citizens of that country. They cannot take all causes just because they feel like. Though the US welcomes immigrants and migrants, they are still required to comply with the law, raising critical questions about the balance between personal freedoms and legal obligations. Amidst a growing threat of annexation from a volatile Trump administration in the White House, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's first major decision since taking office last week is to call for snap elections, either to be held on 28th of April or 5th of May, a move that is aimed at taking advantage of the Liberal Party's recent surge in opinion polls since Carney's arrival. Last month found Liberals topping the Conservatives for the first time in several years. With Canada's businesses reeling from a trade war with the US, Carney, who is a former two-time central banker, is expected to pitch himself as the candidate best suited to take on Donald Trump. And that sentiment is the reason why the Liberal Party's ratings are recovering. For the Conservative Party, though, and Pierre Poilievre, often seen as drawing inspiration from Trump and his antics, the road is now suddenly less unclear after losing an easy political target in Justin Trudeau. For India, this is a very important election, viewers. New Delhi will want to see how the primary parties will approach the security issue related to the Khalistanis and whether the extremist, that is Jagmeet Singh's party, has any political relevance whatsoever in these upcoming elections. Protests erupt across Turkey, with thousands flooding the streets and clashes with riot police taking place. With police using tear gas and rubber bullets, the protests are sparked by a fierce fight for democracy, unlike anything seen in years. And at the center of the unrest is the mayor of Istanbul, who has emerged as the primary challenger to President Erdogan. Just days before he was expected to run for president, he was arrested on charges of corruption and aiding a terrorist group. His university degree has also been annulled, potentially disqualifying him from the presidential race. Despite a 4-day ban on public gatherings, thousands are chanting anti-Erdogan slogans to show their solidarity with the Istanbul mayor. As protests intensify, the government is tightening control, blocking roads, halting metro services, restricting social media. Turkey's democracy is under siege like never before, and Erdogan's 22-year-old reign is now under threat for the first time. In what may be a huge snub to Mohammad Yunus, the interim leader of Bangladesh, Prime Minister Modi is unlikely to accept his request for a meeting at the sidelines of the BIMSTEC summit in early April in Thailand. Mohammad Yunus has met all major global leaders. He's traveled to China, has even met the top leadership of Pakistan, but has not bothered to meet Indian leadership. India and Bangladesh ties have been strained by the violent attacks on Hindu minorities ever since the student revolution, mainstreaming of Islamist parties, and the effort to scrub India's efforts towards Bangladeshi independence and freedom have further affected and strained ties between the two sides. With that, is a wrap on this edition of India Sense. Thanks so much for watching.